Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to Soil Stories. My name is Claudia Reynoso with the New Mexico Healthy Soil Working Group, and I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Isabel Jenikis and Rob Hirsch. We are pleased to host Mandy Ellerton and David LeZaks, who are co-authors of the newly released report, The Regenerative, Agriculture, and Human Health Nexus, Insights from Field to Body. This is an amazing report and really exciting read. It really connects the soil microbes and the gut microbes and all of the important questions that we'll be asking in this next decade of research in soil health and human health. So really exciting work. I hope you guys had a chance to read it. And if you haven't, please take some time to read through that report. Thank you, David and Mandy, for making the time to be here today. And thank you all for joining us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be with all of you on this Thursday evening. I guess you all are transitioning into evening. I'm based in Minneapolis and it is dark. It is evening. So it's really wonderful to be together. We're going to start just by introducing ourselves briefly, and then we're going to skim through at a high level some of the concepts from our paper, hopefully taking just about 20 to 30 minutes so we can have a nice chunk of time to discuss and hear your ideas as well. So just a little bit more about me, and thank you, Isabel, for that kind introduction. So I was saying when we were warming up for this conversation before you all joined, that I often gloss over my personal connection to these issues, and I should start there, I think. So I am someone who has struggled with chronic health issues most of my adult life, and I would imagine there's some of you who have experienced this too. Hard to get a diagnosis, hard to find good care, hard to be believed. And finally, over time, I realized that making adjustments to my diet and paying attention to where my food comes from and paying attention to how my body feels when I eat more nutritious food, I started to heal. It's going to be a lifelong journey for me, something I'm always tinkering with, but it's why I care so much about this. And I hope that by feeding my children more nutritious food, I'm going to prevent them from having the same kinds of struggles that I had. So that's my personal connection to the issue. A little bit about my professional background. I started out my career as a social worker, actually working with individuals experiencing trauma. And I moved into community organizing to try and change systems that were causing some of the traumatic events and circumstances for people. And that led me to philanthropy and impact investing to see about how money flows into these systems and causes challenges and problems, and how we might shift capital and be financial activists in order to do better for our communities. And so I recently wrapped up a career at a private foundation based in St. Paul, Minnesota. I live in Minneapolis. And I left so that I could focus more fully on these issues that we're about to talk about tonight. So it's a little bit about me. David, who are you?
Thanks, Mandy. Good evening. And again, my name is David LeZaks. I'm a senior fellow at Croatan Institute. We're a nonprofit that whose mission is to build social equity and ecological resilience by leveraging finance to create pathways to a just economy. And my background and what has helped me connect a lot of these dots and more from a personal side, as Mandy shared, is that my father actually died of colon cancer quite young in my life. I was not yet 3. And that's always been something that has kind of hovered over my life and with my family. And I went on and went through my education and got a Ph.D. in environmental science. And I've always treated those things of kind of my family and my family's health and potential impacts on my health as well, with everything I was doing out in the environment, in the environmental field, and agriculture and sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture in my career. And it wasn't until when actually Mandy and I met back in 2018, 2019, through a program offered by the RSF Social Finance and their Integrated Capital Institute, that brought together about 25 financial activists. So there's actually like more than 100 of us now that identify as financial activists, to really get together and think about how to shift capital to bring about both social and environmental change. And so back in 2018, it was actually about 3 years ago. It was November at that time. It was our first time meeting. We were out on a walk with Sally Calhoun, who many of you may know, who owns and runs and helps to manage the Piscinas Ranch. And we just got into a conversation about the soils and the soil microbes and the soil microbiome and the gut microbiome and the relationship between nutrition and nutrient dense foods. And really, we stopped very quickly seeing those as separate things, but really as two sides to the same coin. And as part of that experience, as part of that 9-month integrated capital intensive that we went through, is that Mandy and I went and designed this strategy of how one, if they had the resources, would put forward capital of different sorts to invest in kind of this relationship between soils and human health. And since that time, we've I think both made career and organizational shifts, but we thought that it was just so important to get some of this story out. So we had a little bit of support from our colleague at Basil's Harvest, Aaron Meyer, and we put a lot of the stuff that we had been thinking about in the last couple of years on paper. And it's really part of this broader movement building and the use of stories and storytelling to really kind of connect some of these neurons and these ideas and the people who are really at the foundation and the core of this movement between agriculture and human health that we're working to connect as part of what we're doing here today, and more broadly in addition to that. So while we wanted to put forward this information in the form of a paper and a report to get it out there, to have that discussion, the intentions here are greater. The intentions here are really around movement building, around action, around the movement of capital of different kinds, of financial capital, of political capital, and other types as well. And to get into some of the content, some of the overview of the paper, I put the link in the chat before, but just wanted to give a high-level overview for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet. And one of the concepts that we introduced, at least in this paper, co-developed by our colleague Eric Jackson, is this 4 levels of nutritional wisdom. And when we say that, we're really talking about, we know there's lots of interventions that are working to connect agriculture, regenerative agriculture, human health on one end, usually through food as kind of that intermediary. And there's different ways in which that can be done. And so here we introduce this level 1 replacement, where we're taking ultra processed, low nutrient dense foods and maybe replacing them with something like whole foods or more fruits and vegetables in the diet, and whole grains and meats and such. That's level 1. So we see veggie prescription boxes or veggie boxes as one way in which that's being done. A lot of government interventions and food programs are really focused on that level 1 as well. Level 2, free from chemical and drug inputs, relatively self-explanatory in terms of removing agrochemicals from our agricultural and food systems. And so we see organic is a great example of that. Level 3, differentiated nutrient density. Science over the past a couple of years and a couple of scientific campaigns have shown that a carrot is not a carrot, as we see here by our beautifully colored carrots that we included in the report. Same is true for beef and other things that we eat as well. And we're beginning to realize not just that there are differences in our food, but some of those differences are based on the climate, on genetics, on management practices, specifically related to how that land is managed. And so that's where we really get into the soil microbiome piece. And then level 4 is about this kind of more of a microbiome centric. We realize that there's a a soil microbiome, there's a human microbiome, and they're actually more related than we think that they are. For instance, there's interventions that are really working to not only better understand these microbiomes, but to really intervene in them. So for instance, when we have a sick or a dysbiotic system, to go through this process of rebiosis and of healing in soils, in some cases, composts are used, where we're introducing new mixes or strains of or communities really of microbes. And in humans, we're finding ways to do that too, with fecal microbiome transplants is one interesting way that is being explored right now. And so it's these different levels that we're starting to kind of tag some of these interventions that we're looking at, and where it's investment, where it's policy, where it's technical assistance, where it's movement building, that are working to move from where we're really focused on now, which is level 1 and level 2, to kind of these deeper levels of understanding these relationships between agriculture, food, health, and the environment, where we're getting more to level 3 and level 4.
Great. So a big part of this paper for us was investigating a little bit more what we all mean when we talk about agriculture influencing human health, especially regenerative agriculture. It's been really exciting to see the regenerative agriculture movement start to embrace the idea that how we grow our food matters to human health. And we've also seen that sometimes in those conversations, we're kind of glossing over some of the complexity of that, what we call the journey from the field to the human body. So we wanted to look at that complexity and say, well, what does the evidence tell us about those connections? What do we know? What do we not know? So as we were starting to look at abundant evidence out there, we thought, how can we categorize this evidence a little bit more so we can understand it? So we thought about the journey from field to human body, and thought about kind of those milestones along the way, or ways to categorize that journey. So we created this this diagram to depict that journey. So we looked at first of all, what we all mean by more nutritious food in the first place. Then we looked at the moment that we harvest and process food as being a key moment that can affect the nutrient qualities of food. And there's the huge category of purchase, access, and preparation. So how do consumers get their hands on this more nutritious food? How do they have access to it? Are we putting it in places where all people can access it? And can all people actually afford this kind of food? What are the economics behind that? And then how people are preparing it. It all has something to do with the nutrient qualities of that food. And then we looked at the moment where someone's actually eating that food and they're digesting it, and hopefully their body's absorbing it properly. I think there's a lot that we don't talk about in the human body that affects the body's ability to actually unlock those nutrients. And then we ended with, of course, the whole goal of all of this, which is human health. So what do we mean by a thriving human, and what does that look like? What do we know about the kinds of nutrients that a human needs to thrive? So as we laid this out, we started to realize that it's actually a bi-directional relationship. So we thought about it initially as the nutrient dense food is making its way from the field to the person and into their body, but also we need to think of it in the opposite direction as well, that the person needs to be primed and healthy enough to accept and assimilate those nutrients from the food. So we're still wrapping our minds around that idea, but that seems to be a really important point. We will admit that it was challenging to find the right scope for this paper, because there's a lot of discussion about the management practices that create healthier soils and more nutrient dense food. We felt like there was enough leadership and commentary and research on that topic elsewhere that we didn't include it in this paper, but it may be part of our discussion tonight. So we're really glossing over the detail here. We want to share a couple of our kind of summary reflections, but if there's any part of this that you want to dive into with more detail, we would be more than happy to do that. So I think when we look at all of this evidence, we look at this journey, we are first and foremost left with the reflection, the main takeaway that, can I have the next slide, David? That there's supposed to be a dramatic moment there, that growing more nutritious food does in fact influence human health. So we feel, in looking at the evidence, fairly confident in that. That said, there is never going to be probably one unified study that knits all of this together and shows all of these connections. We do think there's lots of room for more research to be done, which we can all talk about, but we do think there is a major connection there. And even as there are those connections, next slide, David, the relationship between agriculture and human health is, I know this isn't going to surprise you all, it's complex, it's dynamic. If you think about that journey and everything that happens along that journey, and that we eat maybe 3-ish times a day, our bodies are in different states of health, and our microbiomes vary pretty greatly. I mean, there's so much complexity here to unlock. So we want this movement to be talking thoroughly about these connections, but acknowledge to one another, it just ain't so simple that we grow this food and bada bing, bada boom, people eat it and they're healthy. There's a lot more to it. So I'll hand it over to David for some of our reflections since we wrote the paper.
Yeah, we definitely didn't want to come this evening and talk to you about everything that's in the paper, because the paper's out there. You can go and read it. But in since even the paper was published, I think we probably could have made it twice as long easily. Just looking at some of the discussion in the chat, about linear versus circular. We actually had multiple versions of that figure that Mandy was just reviewing that did that was actually more circular. And we said, oh gosh, that's a whole nother section of the paper that I don't think we can write now, and talking about night soil and closed nutrient loops, which are all part of this bigger piece. We just had to create a boundary. But we also realized that these connections and this narrative and this broader movement building is also connected to a lot of other things that weren't in the paper that Mandy and I have been thinking a lot about. For instance, we realize that, and we know, and has been said many times, that the cost of cheap food is actually very expensive. And our current economic system and this idea of this late stage capitalism that we're in just doesn't reflect the true costs of our current food system. And we see this grand experiment that we're doing and the influence of social determinants of health, of commercial determinants of health, of how companies kind of offload negative, specifically health consequences for profit from a corporate side, as part of this broken capitalistic system that we have. And so when we're thinking about how do we reimagine, or how do we test, and how do we spread and scale these, what a different, better food system ultimately looks like, we realize that we have to not say that, capital and the use of money and the flows of finance is separate than that. We have to really bake that in to make sure that growing nutrient-dense foods that are going to be a part of healthier outcomes and lower management of the cost that relates to those health outcomes are baked into whatever our next economic system is going to look like. So for us and for kind of many of our colleagues who are working in this area, just stopping at getting better food on plates is not enough. Is that we see deeper and bigger levels of interventions that are necessary, and bigger systemic shifts that are going to need to change if humans as a species are going to be on this planet for this century and beyond. And again, it's not just food that affects our health. It's clearly the environment and things that have happened or changed the environment, and this idea of the exposome that is relatively recently newly been introduced into the literature, but how the determination of health outcomes in people is a function of all of these things that we're exposed to. And so everything from stress and family determinants to are we being exposed to chemicals that we didn't know about, or are we getting the micronutrients, the macronutrients, and the bioactive compounds from the foods that are actually going to nourish us and keep us in a state of health as opposed to going into a state of disease. And so these are all integral parts of this broader conversation that we just wanted to make sure were were linked in some way to what we wrote in the paper and the relatively narrow scope that we had to decide on there, but also wanting to make sure that whether through this discussion or after, is that these are things that Mandy and I are thinking about, I'm going to say, every day, as to how these different pieces of this dialogue really fit into a more holistic system of and vision and view of what do we do next and how can we contribute positively to that. And we know enough to act, as Mandy said, is that we could probably research all of this until we are more than blue in the face. But on the other hand, is that we know already from the perspective of whether it's the exposome of, we are being exposed to a whole bunch of nasty chemicals in particular that we know have negative impacts on human health, that there's enough to act. We know that there are ways, especially from a research perspective, looking back and looking currently at the traditional ecological knowledge, at indigenous wisdom, that there are knowledge bases that can inform the way that we do agriculture today, and that respects ways in which the relationship with the land is, in many cases and in many places, different than it is now. And so it's, how can we learn? How can we respect? How can we bridge some of these different knowledge bases in order to, again, think globally and act locally, in terms of, we know that every acre, every garden, or every parcel of land is going to be managed using the context in that place with those people. And so that really brings us to what might those actions look like now that we know that we have enough information to act, and we're not waiting for some silver bullet here that's going to flip us into a state of action, but that we do have enough information, and we need to be continuously learning from anything we do, any intervention that we do make, but that can happen yesterday as opposed to tomorrow.
Great. So we want to just kind of wet your whistle and open up this discussion by throwing out some of the activities that we think might be called for based on what we learned. We are thinking about whether there's some sort of a follow-up paper or activity or something that starts to talk about action more concertedly, to say, okay, so if we know this stuff, what are we going to do about it? And then to highlight some bright spots happening around the world where people really are making progress to really live out the connections between agriculture and human health. So these are just a few of the ideas that came up for us. I mean, there's obviously a lot of work to be done in terms of supporting more farmers to transition. So it's not enough to just spark folks' imagination. We have to finance them to make that transition. And there needs to be a big, huge shift in capital in order for that to happen. There's also, you'll see these two purple boxes are kind of similar in that, what if we had more pesticide reduction sorts of stewardship projects, just as in the healthcare side, antibiotic stewardship projects that reduce the exposure to these chemicals that kill the microbes in these different ecological systems, be it in a field or in a human gut. And And then all along the line, there's different technologies that we can maybe imagine. We don't think technology is actually the solution totally, but there might be some technologies that are useful. There's tons of opportunity for political and legislative advocacy, and potentially some lawsuits. If you're feeling real feisty, we could maybe all align and get some lawsuits going. There's maybe some entrepreneurship of starting things like some food companies that really maximize the nutrition of well-grown food, access infrastructure like groceries, retail, other retail sites, and then helping new healthcare providers get up off the ground. I think that's an area that we haven't talked a ton about, and there's really ripe potential. So if our current medical systems are not supporting this idea that there's a connection between agriculture, food, and human health, maybe we need to think about healthcare systems differently as well. So we'll leave it, I think, at that, to just wet your whistle and see what questions you have, ideas you have, comments. We're in the process of learning from lots of networks and people just as much as we're putting our ideas out there. So please jump in.
Okay, so thank you so much for your presentation. It's wonderful, the summary, and as was said, the actual full report is a must read. So we really appreciate all the work you've done and the encouragement you are giving to take action in this important field. So anyway, we just encourage people who have questions to post them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. I wanted to make sure Thalia, who's been commenting, could maybe unmute and ask some questions or make some comments.
Hi, everybody. I'm just trying to close up my office here. I'm a healthcare practitioner. I want to go home. No, I mean, you guys are doing a great job. The thing I'll say that I haven't seen actually anywhere else, and I love it, is this whole idea of re-educating our whole medical system and our medical students. And there is a group out there that's connected with Healthcare Without Harm, young medical professionals, young doctors in training, nurses in training. And so that's really great, but it's very, very small. And, you know, doctors have a lot of authority in Western medicine. And so the more of them that get on board with exactly what you guys are presenting, I just can't say enough for that. But I wish I had more cogent questions right now, but I'm a little fuzzy brain. I'd rather ask you questions and have you talk than have me talk. I'm like,
And is that network you're talking about the one that's more specifically focused on climate change that Healthcare Without Harm is supporting?
They do that, but and they're instructing they have a lot. I think they have a lot more with that, but there is definitely a contingent that's very much aware of this, the whole dysbiosis in our guts. And one thing I heard, I'll just bring it up. I'd love it if somebody else knows more about this or have heard better information about this, is with those fecal transplants, like people got really excited about that. And then I heard, and they were very effective, but then they were only effective for about 3 to 6 months. And what would happen is that then if those people who got the transplant didn't adapt certain aspects of the lifestyle of the person who they got the transplant from, the transplant didn't hold. And it makes me wonder about all this inoculation that we're doing on the ground, on the landscape. And if there's a transposition there about, well, you know, yeah, people are shaking their heads. Yes. So can anybody talk to that? Because I know nothing about it.
Yeah, I mean, we're not experts on FMT, but we've been watching that too, where it initially a lot of excitement, and I think where it's mostly been used is in really acute cases of C. diff infections, and it does seem to save lives. But in terms of the longer term effects, there's a company locally in Minneapolis that's working on this, and they were mentioning to me that, yeah, they're finding that after, they said more like a year, but interesting to hear if you've heard more 3 to 6 months, that it can just totally revert back or not sustain. And it does require eating almost exclusively the exact diet as the donor. But I'm not an expert, but I am watching a little bit of this and wondering if that, like you said, if that's true, what does that mean for the fields that we're using somewhat similar interventions on? David, what would you add?
I mean, I was going to add on the soil side is that we've seen similar responses where you include compost additions or other things, then you start using diversification and no-till and cover crops where you have enough water to do all these things, and then you stop and the system reverts back to what it was. So and I think it speaks to something that Mandy and I talk a lot about is that there's no pills, potions, or fairy dust that are going to get us out of this. And there's no one thing that's just going to like flick a switch and be able to, change the outcomes or, change, what's happening within, either the soil or the human system. But it's really about how can we fundamentally rethink these day-to-day actions that lead to a wholly different set of outcomes.
That's a great point. I'll just add one other thing in case anyone has just heard of this. One of the things I heard about the appendix is we don't really know what it's for. It's a vestigial organ. Maybe it has something to do with the immune system. But what I heard they're starting to think is that actually deep in, that is where our original gut microbiome will go to hide out when it gets attacked. Like if we eat like rancid salami or something like that, right? And that then the gut can profusely recolonize itself healthfully just within a matter of a day or two. There was a guy in a clinic, in an office, in a lab in Boston, and all these guys in Boston, they took a stool sample every day and they were tracking the microbiome. And one of them did, they ate some horrible piece of deli meat and he just, dumped everything out of his system, and they took water sample basically is what it would be, right? And there was like no microbiome left. And in 24 hours, he had repopulated himself. And it makes me wonder, so do we have something like that in the soil, right? And the sense of, one of the things that Western medicine, I think, does not embrace is the fact that the system is made to heal. And a lot of things about helping it heal is getting it out of the way, right? Getting toxins out of the way and simply being supportive. Anyway, I don't know if anyone has a comment on that.
So I can speak a little bit about the microbial ecology of soils. So I'm a microbial ecologist by training. So, and I work in, so a lot of what you're talking about like resonates very deeply with me. So, to talk about soils, so I've studied, currently I work in the arena of looking at how management of different farm soils influences the microbial community. And we're starting to kind of tap into that. In my former life, I worked more with forests and urban settings, and we just published a study this year where we looked at the microbial community in urban versus rural forests. And what we found is that in urban forests, they take a huge amount of pressure from the environment. So you have urban heat island effects and you have nutrient deposition, and there is shifts in the microbial community. But when we got to the interior of these forests, the microbial community was exactly the same as what you would find in a rural forest. But on the edges, it was different. So what that tells us is that soils can take, unfortunately, they can take a huge beating, right? They can take a lot of environmental pressure, but once they hit that tipping point, it takes forever to get them back. And it takes a lot of management to recover that. So I think to speak a little bit about what Dave was saying with irrigation and different cover crops and compost additions and stuff like that, you can rehabilitate the microbial community. So a lot of times what I'll say is like, well, if you build the chemistry, the microbes will show up because they are transient. So, and then to kind of jump to a little bit what you're talking about from the health field, because I've been kind of curious about that as well, because we're looking at this question of nutrient density and soil health. And then I can go on this whole different, I can Shanghai this entire meeting and talk about how do we define soil health, but I won't do that right now. So, but when you talk about human health, if you think about when you take an antibiotic and it just wrecks your system, right? So what you've basically done is you've completely demolished your microbial, the community that lives in your gut, and then you replace that by the foods that you eat. So, and what you were saying with these fecal transplants, that they were really great, but unless that person that got that transplant adopts the eating habits of the person they got the transplant from, it won't take, because what happens is microbes are insidious as well. So the big dominant populations will take over the more the smaller populations, for lack of a better term, or what we call the more niche organisms. So it's, again, I would think that your gut microbiome is a lot like the soil microbiome. It can take a huge beating, but at some point you're going to tip, and then it takes a lot to get it back. So.
Well, exactly. And so thank you so much for adding that commentary in and that richness to the discussion. I think what's going through my mind is some of the recent Sonnenberg research that actually shows evidence of extinction events in the human gut, which I think the first time I read one of those studies, I just, had in my hands like, oh man. So I think the idea of gut rebiosis, I think we're still, in the healthcare community in early days of figuring out what it means to restore the human gut once it's been really damaged. I know that from personal experience, but I also see that there's a great question in here from Elaine about supply chain opportunities. And I will say that when we looked at the evidence around how the harvest, processing, distribution phase of that journey from the field to the human goes, that was an area that probably had the least evidence, the least research as it pertains to nutrient qualities, how some of those systems affect nutrient quality. So we were looking at what does the evidence say about storage, for example. So how long you store a food before it gets to human, or what the conditions are in that storage system. So we still have a lot of questions about that, but I think we all know, and I'm sure you talk about this a ton more than we do, that if we think part of the answer is a more local food system, we really need to dramatically rethink supply chains, right? So David, I'm sure you have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we found in our research, and something very similar just was a conclusion in a paper that David Montgomery and Ann Bickley published on soil health and nutrient density, is that, across the kind of three broad categories that fall under nutrient density one way or the other, of macronutrients, micronutrients, and then bioactive compounds like antioxidants and polyphenols, that the soil health connection and the structure of the soil microbiome really affects most strongly those bioactive compounds. And so the relationship then between processing, storage, cooking, fermenting on those bioactive compounds is the piece that we really haven't. We were unable to find research on that. Whether it exists or not, I don't know, but we were unable to find much. But we hear stories and anecdotes all the time about picking fruit and vegetables before they're ripe and then shipping it halfway across the world, or tomatoes that were bred to stand up to transportation, but we refer to them as like cardboard tomatoes, that they just don't taste very good. And it's that taste that we're probably tasting those bioactive compounds that are the ones that are actually known to provide the health benefits. So as Mandy said, we need to rethink our food infrastructure if we're going to able to get these things out of the soil or through the soil, or in cooperation with the soil more appropriately. We're going to have to figure out how to change that mid-tier infrastructure in order to deliver those benefits all the way to the person.
Just quickly want to chime in and say thank you to Thalia for bringing up the points, and Carl for your contribution, and Isabel commented that you actually reviewed the work that Mandy and Dave did on the report, and your work is invaluable. Also, Elaine, I know Mandy addressed part of your question, but if you wanted to unmute and add anything, please, we'd love to see you if you'd like to share further. And there are others too that have questions and comments we want to get to.
Well, Thank you, Rob. I would just say I'm in Santa Fe, so I'm looking at New Mexico and what our group is doing in relation to finance and connecting finance to supporting farmers and all those other things that got talked about tonight. What we know is that in New Mexico, we are exporting most of the food we grow and raise, and we are importing most of the food that we eat. And one of the things that I wrote down was, we know enough to act. There may not be a lot of data, but we know about the environmental impact, just for starters, of doing that, of sending our good wheat and corn and sending our livestock out of state because we can't process them in state. And then bringing back the products, that the food that's already been processed and packaged and distributed from someplace else. We know the environmental impact. So that's one piece of it. And then I just wrote down the storage issue. That's another issue that I hadn't even thought of. How is that being stored, and how early is it being picked? That messes with the environmental impact. I'm very grateful for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. And obviously, if David and Mandy want to comment, please do so. And if not, Jay Valencia had a comment that I wanted to give him a chance to chime in on.
Elaine said something about supply chain, and I don't know. I've been involved with this conversation for many years now. And we study having the conversation and not coming with your own agenda, not coming with a bulleted list, because people just glaze over, and painting a picture, which I think you kind of did there, David, in the beginning. So thanks for being here, man. I think Elaine said something about supply chain, and it I don't know, it kind of felt like the conversation was going so broad that we might not talk about anything specific tonight. But I grow microgreens as a result of a lot of life choices in the last 7 or 8 years. We just moved to New Mexico to find a spot where we could grow our own food. I could practice what I've learned about permaculture, taking my certification courses, and then also learning about ecology, ecological design for landscaping, and all the regenerative agriculture and things that Sue is talking about here with my teachers were Alan Savory, Gabe Brown, and Ray Archuleta, and Matt Powers, and Elaine Ingham, and Nicole Masters, and all these people that I've been learning from. I gave you a few great books that I also read. Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, from Dave Montgomery. He was another teacher that chimed in. I had a great permaculture course that had about 50 people, and it was a global community. Obviously, we're all reflecting on the same latitude, especially because our latitudes reflect what we can grow, no matter where we are on the planet. But so I'm painting broad strokes there, but I came down here to reduce our carbon footprint, grow our own food, get healthier. My delivery route for the business is literally a 25-mile circle. I'm not into growth. I'm anti-growth. Everybody's like, you should be in Walmart. You should be in Albertsons. You should. I should get a shirt that says you should. But I literally am hyper. My business model is hyper local. I'm hyper focused. And I love that. I see Carl nodding there and smiling and stuff, and it's good to that people share these perspectives. And then where Carl's come from, Ecology. I mean, that stuff's just not even studied. I mean, one of my teachers, Peter McCoy, who Carl probably knows, Peter McCoy wrote this book called Radical Mycology, and it's about, this thick. Pretty much everything you want to know about mushrooms. But, there's just things that aren't even studied because of the money that controls our universities, So, yeah, I do think, like Sue said, there's misinformation out there. The soil. I studied with D.D. Pershouse, who wrote Ecology of Care, and the soil sponge is also another word for the soil food web. And the fact that we can, and Jeff Lawton, it's like, people think it takes a long time to regenerate soil. It on a larger scales, it takes a little longer, but it's just really like, people are trying to hide the information that we can do this a lot faster than projected by bigger voices that can reach a lot more people very quickly. But what I'm doing here as a market gardener is trying to reach people, and I don't even worry about people popping up selling microgreens. It's just like more educating, more marketing, whatever, get those microgreens out there. I'm not worried about another market gardener popping up. I mean, we need thousands of 2 to 5 to 10 acre farmers out there.
So Jay, thank you so much for your comments.
Man, sorry, I'm going till somebody tells me to stop.
Well, I'm only doing so out of respect for other people who have comments and questions too, and we're running out of time, but thanks for all you're doing. And you mentioned Sue Van Hook. I want to give her a chance to chime in, obviously. And also, of course, David and Mandy a chance to respond. And also Jim and Chris have comments too. So I want to make sure they all have a chance. Peace.
Thank you, everyone. This is a wonderful conversation, much needed. I'm a mycologist by training. I know Peter McCoy very well. And I also study with the same people that Jay has, D.D. Pershouse and Walter Yene, to mention a few. One thing we forget is that bacteria have been on the planet for 3.5 of the 4.5 billion years of its history. And fungi have been on the planet about 1.7, 1.5 billion years of the planet's history. And they know far more than we ever will in terms of intelligent life and response. And I think it was Thalia that said something about, we don't have to fix anything. Nature can heal itself very readily. We just have to get out of her way and stop polluting and being destructive. So I think that's something to keep in mind going forward here with these great ideas for how we make this huge shift in human health and medicine and our food systems. So I've been involved my entire life with climate change and carbon. I've known about it since the 1965 first report on carbon to President Johnson, and been teaching all about it all those years too, as a biologist. So the most compelling thing for me is to get this food agriculture story ahead of the fossil fuel emissions story. We just had Glasgow finish a few days ago, and according to Walter Yene's calculations, which I think he's brilliant, fossil fuel emissions are only contributing about 5% to our global carbon emissions, and it's our bare soils that are off-gassing far more carbon because the microbes are giving it up because they have nothing to feed on and keep it intact. And I think that's the biggest piece to giving people hope. When I speak about climate change and climate crisis, I try to plant these seeds of hope, is that it won't take us that long if we do these conversions to using healthy soil practices that you all are aware of. It just won't take that long. And it's being done on large scale, China with John Liu, and in India, Didi is working on, I think, 50,000 acres right now. And so it's happening in Africa, it's happening everywhere. And on a big webinar that I was on, conference call, we discussed about hubs of information, and this report I'm looking forward to reading that you've just put out. But we don't really have time to really organize it in hubs, like just one farm at a time, let's just do it. And I want just to keep in mind that the microbes are our allies. They want to help, they will help, and it really won't be that difficult if we can educate people to what this transformation of soil health into human health looks like.
Thank you so much, Sue. Those are wonderful comments. And quickly, because we're running out of time, if we could just have Jim and Chris unmute and give a comment, and then David and Mandy can conclude before the end of the half hour their responses and thoughts. And I'm sorry that we're running out of time, but we really appreciate the rich discussion.
This is Jim. I'm a functional neurologist, so I'd just like to say that I've been having to correct microbiome imbalances for at least 35 years now. And you don't have to do it with fecal implants. And also, I do a lot of testing with, there's some labs now that actually can determine what's, the state of your microbiome, and you can figure out exactly what you need to take to correct it. And there's a reason they call the gut now the second brain. And being a neurologist, I figured that out a long time ago.
I think it's such an interesting question. As we went along and looking at the evidence, we kept wanting more on the specifics of nutrient density. The Bionutrient Food Association is working hard on this, and I hope that they'll provide more detailed research soon. They just launched this project to work specifically on grass-fed beef, so we'll see what happens. So I don't know how hopeful I am in the macro about that, and as there are thousands and thousands of compounds within food that we don't yet know or understand. But I think there's more progress to be made, and hopefully some of that evidence will make a difference in, like you said, in guiding policy or shifting opinions. David, what would you add?
I mean, to that question specifically, I mean, there's a difference between knowing whether it's the nutritional dark matter and the 20,000 plus compounds in every food that we don't really know about yet. And again, do we have enough to act? Yeah, we are gaining the understanding that there are ways in which we manage our land and agriculture that have differences in how that affects the food, and then how that affects our short-term and long-term health. And I think it's important to note that we eat 3-ish times a day, and again, it's not a pill or potion or fairy dust that's going to help us. It's what we're doing every day, and it's really about how we as a society get better at managing ecologies, and whether those ecologies are within us or around us. We've done a really good job of dominating those ecologies as opposed to learning how to live with the ecologies that we are nested within. And I think there's just a trend that we think of humans as being separate from the ecologies in which we live, and we're just another mammal species. We happen to have a different kind of brain than many others do, but we're just another mammal. So we follow those same laws of nature that everything else does. So I think that, in general, we're just going to have to, just like what we're seeing with the climate change, we're going to have to learn and make these transitions and transformations faster than we have in the past. And I think, myself, I think there's, great hope, as others have said, not just from, youth and what we can learn and what we can teach youth, but also realizing that so much on the human side starts off with how children coming into this world are affected in their first 3 years, and how their own microbiome in their gut and elsewhere develops over those first 3 years. So everything from birth and things before birth to what those kids are exposed to and what they eat through school programs and school meals and at home in those first 3 years is so critical to making sure that they are set on a pathway for the rest of their lives almost, that is going to, again, keep them in those states of health and away from things that might shift into that dysbiotic state.
I want to just thank David and Mandy so much for your presentation tonight and answering questions. And it's so important that we act on this critical issue of gut health and soil health.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate all this.
Thank you for having us.
discussion.
Thank you so much.
Just
Hasta
like English.
luego.
Agone.
Bye. Adios.
Bye.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Arrivederci.
Chayabona.
Dag.
Thank you all.